Hello everybody, and welcome to the second installment of our liturgical series. We're continuing the series today talking about communion patens or communion plates. So you might be familiar with these. This is what they look like. So you see it's a handle and then literally just kind of a paten at the end of it, right? And the purpose of these is to be held under those who are communicating when you are receiving communion, with the intention that if the host for any reason should fall while Holy Communion is being distributed, then instead of falling to the ground, it falls on this plate, this paten. And of course that is just with the intention of maintaining the greatest reverence we possibly can for Holy Communion. And of course also on top of that, the idea is that any particles that might fall while Holy Communion is being distributed would fall on this paten, and then whoever is holding it, usually a server nowadays, would bring this back and the priest would purify it. So you've seen the purifications at the end of communion. So with a paten, usually the priest just kind of wipes down the whole surface of it with his finger, making sure that any particles that would be on there end up in the chalice. And then, of course, he pours water over his fingers, or has water poured over his fingers, or dips his fingers in the ablution bowl. All of those methods are ways of removing any particles that might be left on his fingers, and then that ablution is either left to allow the particles to dissolve so that Christ is no longer present in the sacrament there, or is, if you're pouring into the chalice, then the priest simply consumes that water. So all of this is just with a mind to maintain that reverence and really to acknowledge and to treat the Eucharist for what it is, which is the true presence of Jesus Christ. And so that's really the purpose of these. An interesting history to them. Really, these are somewhat, I guess you could say, an innovation in the church, in the sense that they came about in kind of at the turn of the 20th century. So about 100 years ago, a little over. And what they came to replace were cloths that would be held at the communion rail. So at the communion rail, there would be a cloth that would go over the rail. You'd put your hands under it, and my understanding is, I've actually not seen them in use, but you'd hold them up under you when you're receiving communion for the same purpose, right? But of course, these came in as a way of, the cloth, certainly if the host fell, the host would fall on the cloth, right? And then the priest could still pick up that host and distribute. The kind of improvement that was seen with using a paten for that purpose is that the paten also catches particles if any should fall, and then those can be purified, which can't really happen very easily with a cloth. I'm sure they tried to fold it up in a certain way and then soaked it and so on. Well, actually, I'm not sure, but I assume there was some accounting for that with that. But the paten is just a much easier way to try to hold that reverence for every particle of the Eucharist, and try to make sure that no particle is dropped to the ground during the Holy Mass. And so that's the purpose of it. That's how it came about. And we can ask, well, okay, we know that those were around before the Second Vatican Council, and that basically they disappeared, not entirely, but in a general way they disappeared afterward. And so what was up with that? Well, that didn't come from the council itself. The council didn't address that, obviously, in its own documents. Like we said before, the documents were pretty vague. They gave some broad direction to how reforms were going to be made, but they left those reforms to be made by the working group that put out the new missal. And so in the general instruction of that missal, we do have, in the same paragraph we actually looked at in our first video, the paragraph that talks about the things you prepare when you're preparing for Mass. So one of the things you set out at the credence table is, so this is number 118 in the germ, it includes in this list the communion plate for the communion of the faithful. And then that's not mentioned again, except kind of vaguely in one place where it talks about if you're going to communicate by intinction. They specifically mention using a communion pattern there. But obviously it's implied that you would use this in general at any Mass, because it specifically says that one of the things to be prepared for the Mass is the communion pattern for the communion of the faithful. And so right there in the general instruction we have this idea that, this wasn't meant to go away. And yet it did, we know that. And this was probably for various reasons, one of which was certainly, some time after the council, as I talked about in my homily, the introduction of communion in the hand, suddenly that makes it a little more difficult to figure out how do you use the communion pattern? Does it really help very much if people are receiving in the hand, especially at a time when pretty much everybody, not everybody, but the vast majority of people switched over to receiving in the hand? The communion pattern seemed to make a little less sense, or to just be more confusing perhaps. And so I think that was part of the reason it was dropped. Another reason certainly could have been there was a general just introduction of extraordinary, there was the introduction of extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, but in general that was taken to be, and this is something we'll talk about in another video, but that was taken to be a way of participating more in the Mass. So in some places it was encouraged for many people at one Mass, many more than needed even, to distribute communion as extraordinary ministers. And because of that, if you're going to have servers with communion patterns at every place where communion is being distributed, suddenly you need a lot more servers and a lot more communion patterns, right? And so I think that was another reason we kind of saw its demise for a time. And then finally, I hope this wasn't a reason, but certainly we know that there was a loss in Eucharistic faith within the Church for whatever various reasons, and I'm sure that played a part in, even finding the communion pattern to be meaningless, pointless, obsolete. I don't see how you reach that conclusion without, in some sense, having lost some degree of your faith in Christ's presence in the Eucharist. So at any rate, those are some of the reasons, and of course, at every parish where there aren't communion patterns now, are those the reasons that there continue not to be? No, that's not what I'm saying. But that is what happened, and then that's kind of been perpetuated. Now, this is something that John Paul II, there were various things he noticed or heard about in the liturgy in various parts of the world, and it's one of the things that he, through the Congregation for Divine Worship, asked to put an end to kind of this change that was made. So I want to use this particular video as a way of introducing this document that's very important for us. It's called Instruction on the Eucharist. So in 2003, John Paul II put out an encyclical on the Eucharist. And with that encyclical, he basically said, look, there's been a lot of negative results of basically the reforms that people kind of took on themselves to make after the Second Vatican Council. He says this, right, that there have been negative effects, and there have been liturgical abuses, and that this has caused great sorrow to many people. And so he says, I have asked the competent offices of the Roman Curia to prepare a more specific document, including prescriptions of a juridical nature, so specifically saying here's what you can and can't do, on this very important subject, the subject of liturgical abuses. And so he has this prepared, he asks for this to be prepared, and then of course he approves it before it goes through. So this is a very important document. This is a document specifically addressing the question that we have in this whole series, which is what are some of the changes that happened after Vatican II that weren't asked for and that in fact constitute liturgical abuses. John Paul II wanted this addressed very firmly. And he did have it addressed very firmly, but unfortunately, many people are not very familiar with this book. As you can see, it's a pretty small book. It's a pretty easy read too, and it's very, very well worth the read. You can look it up online and find it there on the Vatican website. And so I highly, highly recommend that to you, especially if you have any kind of ministry within the church, if you serve at the Mass, if you're an extraordinary minister, anything like that. A very important work to read, and one that we'll probably refer to a couple times during this series. But specifically with regard to communion patens, it has one sentence, so we'll just read that for today. And this is number 93 in this instruction on the Eucharist. The communion plate for the communion of the faithful should be retained, so as to avoid the danger of the sacred host or some fragment of it falling. Okay, and then it puts a footnote to what we just referenced in the general instruction of the Roman Missal, number 118, that's one of the things to be prepared for the Mass. So here it's just kind of restating the fact that yes, we are supposed to use these, right? They were introduced for a reason, and we were never asked to stop using them, and the reason is just important now as ever. Objectively, subjectively, it's more important now than ever because we've lost a lot of our Eucharistic faith. So to have that sign of the Eucharistic faith, any sign which we can provide to show that Eucharistic faith and bring people back into that Eucharistic faith is a very good thing. And so because of all of that, this is one of the things that we are looking to reintroduce into our parishes here. And so what we're going to do is when the new altar server, when we can start having altar servers again and we begin the new training, we'll train all of the previously trained servers, and we'll train obviously all the new servers as well, but this will be part of the training. We'll kind of figure out the logistics of using those communion patens at our parishes in order to, well, first of all, just in order to follow the instructions of the church who gives us the liturgy. And of course, knowing full well what the meaning and the purpose behind that is, that this is to show reverence for every particle of the Eucharist, because every particle is not just a particle of Christ, but we believe Christ is fully present in every particle of the Eucharist. And to show that reverence for Christ is something obviously very important for us. So this is a little bit on the communion paten. Hopefully that was helpful to you, and hopefully it helps you understand kind of why we're looking to reintroduce it, and I hope you look forward to seeing it as much as I do.